April 14, 1943. In a dimly lit room where the world outside still smelled of salt and smoke, a pencil scratched across a sheet of paper and stopped on a single, ordinary line. Departure, 0600 Tokyo time, April 18. Aircraft, 2 Type 1 bombers, escorted. Route, over Bougainville and south toward Balale. For the dozen figures bent over maps and code tables at the fleet radio unit, that penciled line read like a summons. It named a time, a place, and a man. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy and the officer who had planned the strike on Pearl Harbor. The quiet in that room, the steady scratching and the low murmur of voices would soon turn into something else, an operation that married the boredom of code-breaking to the lightning-fast violence of aerial combat. It would also shock a navy and reshape a war. Yamamoto was not merely another admiral. He was a strategist who had understood the industrial might of the United States and argued vehemently against a long war of attrition. In Tokyo, he moved with the authority of one who had steered his country into conflict. In Allied intelligence circles, he was the single most consequential target the Pacific Fleet could name. To remove him would be to deprive the Imperial Japanese Navy of a strategist, and to deliver a psychological blow that would reverberate in officers' mess halls and supreme councils alike. That was the arithmetic. What made the idea nearly unthinkable was the physics. To reach his inspection flight, American fighters based at Guadalcanal would have to fly well over 600 miles round trip, mostly over open ocean, with only minutes of fuel to spare for combat. The notion of shooting down an admiral is a heavy one in any language. In war, leaders are legitimate military targets, yet the calculus that turns information into action carries its own moral freight. The men who received that penciled itinerary did not imagine glory. They imagined a list of hard, consequential questions. Would the legality of using decrypted communications be defended at the highest levels? Could fighters be sent so far on such a tight margin and expect to find a moving formation? Could radio silence, low-level navigation, and a razor-thin fuel budget be combined into a plan that would put American guns in the right place at the right time? Those questions had answers, but none of them came easily. If you like deep dives into military history and the hidden machinery that makes bold operations possible, subscribe now. This is one of those stories where a pencil and a chart meet metal and gunpowder. Station Hypo, part of the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, was a place that rewarded patience and punished sloppiness. Its specialists learned to read the rhythms of enemy traffic the way sailors learn to read the ocean. Timing, pattern, and the smallest deviation mattered. The decoded message that placed Yamamoto in the air was not the product of a single person's genius so much as the accumulation of small, relentless work. Intercepted transmissions, transcription, frequency tracking, comparative analysis, and the patient filing of plausible translations. There were typists and translators, linguists and mathematicians, men who fed punch cards and turned spools. They invented shorthand for secrecy and for speed. When a translator underlined the line about departure time and passed it to a superior, a chain of professional instincts kicked into motion. This was not a stray communique. It was an itinerary, exact, traceable, and actionable. Those who decoded the message knew two things well. First, that code breaking is an instrument whose power is best conserved by secrecy. Second, that secrecy itself can be a chain that strangles opportunity. If you shout that you can read the enemy's mail, you lose the ability to read the mail. The people in that room balanced the value of a single decisive strike against the long-term advantages of keeping their sources blind. For them, the danger was double. Expose their capability and the enemies would change their ciphers. Act without safeguarding the method and you might win a battle but lose an intelligence war. Within hours, the penciled itinerary moved up the chain. The decoded line passed from linguist to cryptoanalytic team to the staff officer responsible for intelligence briefings at Pacific Fleet Headquarters. Conversations moved from technical jargon into operational English. If Yamamoto traveled on April 18, could fighters find him? What airfields would launch him, and what range would the American fighters need? Which aircraft had the combination of range and firepower required for such a mission? Who would lead it? How would the operation be kept secret even from large parts of the Navy itself? The answers required precision, not broad-brush bravery, but arithmetic, miles, gallons, minutes, and angles. The map on the wall of the planning room was not a poetic war map. It was a bent and stained instrument, scuffed at the edges where planners had traced routes in pencil. From Guadalcanal to the expected interception point and back again, the route stretched to the limits of what a single-engine fighter might attempt. So planners turned to an aircraft that could, in theory, do more. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was, to put it plainly, the only realistic choice. Twin-tailed and twin-engined, it presented an unusual silhouette against the Pacific sky. Its twin Allison engines gave it redundancy. With auxiliary drop tanks, it could extend its operational radius significantly compared to single-engine fighters. It carried a nose-mounted battery of armament, commonly a mix of 20mm cannon and 50 caliber machine guns, that concentrated firepower forward, eliminating the need for convergence settings required by wing-mounted guns. For this mission, those attributes mattered. Range, concentrated fire, and the capacity to return on both engines if one failed. But the P-38 was not a miracle machine. It had flaws that mattered in tropical conditions. Engines could overheat. Early models had performance limitations at low altitude in hot climates, and the fuel-consuming drag of drop tanks had to be jettisoned before combat to make the aircraft adequately maneuverable. The mission planners treated the Lightning's capabilities as tools to be balanced against the mission's constraints rather than as guarantees. If fuel calculations were off by even a few percent, pilots might find themselves gliding into shark-infested waters without the means to get home. The planning staff boiled those tools and risks down to a few brutal figures. The mission would require fighters to take off from Guadalcanal, climb to low-level cruise, fly across open ocean for hundreds of miles, navigating without radio help, approach the Japanese formation at a precise time and place, commit to attack, then return. Total distance, enough to demand 2 drop tanks per fighter and to leave only minutes of fuel for combat. Navigation would be dead reckoning. Time, compass, landmarks that didn't exist over empty sea, and an almost obsessive reliance on synchronized watches. Any deviation, an extra cloud, a stray wind, a minor compass error, would move the intercept point by miles. In the calculus of this operation, miles equaled lives. The operation's human side was as fragile as its machines. Pilots assigned to the task were a mix of personalities. Captain Thomas G. Lanfear, Jr., a flight leader with a taste for audacity and a public manner that favored bold reports, brought a swagger that could convince planners of daring possibilities. Lieutenant Rex T. Barber, on the other hand, was methodical and resolute, a pilot who trusted instruments and tables over theatrics. Besby Frank Holmes, another pilot selected for the flight, was the professional the squadron relied on in the field. Efficient, precise, and used to the grime of maintenance and the loneliness of long patrols. These men were not caricatures. They were professionals who understood that the mission asked more than flying skill. It would demand navigational discipline, strict radio silence, and a willingness to accept orders that would put them miles from rescue if anything went wrong. There were other human elements that rarely make headlines. The maintainers who polished propellers and tuned turbochargers at odd hours. The ordnance crews that ensured ammunition belts fed cleanly. The ground electricians who listened for the smallest notes of engine coughs. A P-38 was only as reliable as the men who kept it alive. Planners knew that a mechanical failure en route would cascade into catastrophe. For those mechanics, the airfield was a cathedral of engines. A frayed wire or a loose nut was treated with a near-religious seriousness. Political considerations threaded through every meeting. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, was presented with the intelligence and the plan. Some later accounts suggest that President Roosevelt was asked whether the mission should proceed and offered terse approval. Historians debate how directly Washington's hand guided the decision-making. What is clear is that senior commanders saw a rare alignment of opportunity and risk, an actionable piece of intelligence that could be exploited with available forces, and a payoff that might justify the operational dangers. But there was another layer to the political calculus: intelligence protection. Acting on a decrypted message meant risking disclosure of the ability to read Japanese naval traffic. To mitigate that, planners considered multiple ways to make the intercept look as if it were the result of ordinary reconnaissance and combat luck, not signals intelligence. The solution had to be surgical and deniable. Maps were rewritten in pencil. Flight planners measured headings in degrees, estimated fuel consumption under varying load, calculated expected ground speeds into trade winds, and plotted a route that hugged the sea to reduce the chance of early detection. The aircraft would fly low to avoid radar and visual spotting. Low-level flight reduced fuel economy but improved the chance of surprise. Pilots trained to fly at treetop height, practicing precise timing over ocean markers, black volcanoes, atolls, and river mouths until the route felt almost muscle memory. Navigation was particularly unforgiving. The squadron would rely heavily on dead reckoning techniques: set the aircraft's compass, note the time over an initial landmark, keep speed steady, and use pre-calculated headings to reach the interception point at the designated hour. Each formation carried synchronized watches set to a single standard. A misset chronometer could shove an entire package of fighters into the wrong spot at the wrong time. In a theater where reconnaissance was sparse and cloud cover capricious, the ability to estimate position from time and heading was tantamount to survival. Even then, there was room for error. The planners also had to think about the enemy aircraft they expected to meet. The Japanese Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber was fast for a twin-engine bomber and carried a long-range fuel load and multiple crew members. It was, however, lightly armored and vulnerable to concentrated fire. Its lack of self-sealing fuel tanks and limited protective armor meant that a proper burst of bullets could quickly turn a Betty into a flaming wreck. Escorting Zeros, the nimble A-6M fighters, posed another threat. The Zero could outturn and outclimb many Allied fighters, especially at low speeds. However, Zeros lacked armored protection, and when confronted by the P-38's concentrated nose gunfire and the Lightning's twin engines, a coordinated attack focusing on speed and tactical surprise could offset the Zero's maneuverability. As plans solidified, the scale of risk became concrete. The operation would send 16 P-38s into the sky in 4 divisions. They would carry drop tanks to extend the Lightning's range, but would have to jettison those tanks before engaging the enemy. That meant that the most dangerous portion of the mission was not the dogfight itself, but the stretch of ocean where fighters had burned through most of their fuel and the drop tanks were already gone. A stretch where the difference between returning and dying could be measured in a few fickle minutes of engine endurance. If a pilot had to ditch, the nearest friendly rescue was hours away. Some downed airmen would never be found. There was also the psychological burden of the mission's clandestine nature. Participants were instructed to speak little of it beyond the flight line and, crucially, to avoid attributing the operation to decoded intelligence should successes be announced. This secrecy created its own moral pressure. To commit to a targeted strike based on intercepted communications was to accept a decision that might never be fully explained. The intelligence officers who recommended the plan had to believe that their ethical duty included protecting the source, knowing that preserving the secret might mean obscuring the truth of an action that would end the life of a single man and alter the leadership of a nation at war. 2 nights before the planned intercept, the men who would fly the mission met over the map. There were briefings that resembled classroom lectures and others that felt like confessions. Pilots listened to navigation officers read headings and estimated winds. They learned precise times for fuel checks and the contingency for an early sighting. They rehearsed jettison procedures and attack profiles. Once visual contact was made, the flight leader would order tanks dropped and climb to an attack altitude calculated to optimize the P-38's speed without losing the element of surprise. Attack would be made head-on where possible. Firing into the Betty's nose would ideally demolish radios and cockpit control systems. But the P-38's favorite profile in such an operation was to approach from slightly above and behind, taking advantage of the lightning speed and forward-firing armament. Lanphier and Barber argued quietly over the best interim tactics. Lanphier favored a more aggressive, dynamic approach. Barber emphasized measured positioning to ensure no mistakes in identification and to prevent friendly fire incidents amidst confusion. The 2 men were not foes. They were competing instincts sewn into the fabric of fighter combat. The instinct to seize and the instinct to calculate. On a mission where minutes meant fuel and seconds decided life or death, both instincts had their stubborn claim to truth. Navigation rehearsals became exercises in mental arithmetic. Pilots memorized points along the route, like a sailor learning reef markers on a charted coastline. A patch of particular cloud shape, a dark swell, the profile of an island. They practiced throttle settings that would yield calculated ground speed under predicted winds. Flight leaders ran tape on the map, showing the intersection between the Japanese schedule and the American route. On paper, it was elegant. In the field, it was precarious. While men rehearsed in hangars, elsewhere a second type of rehearsal was taking place that was less theoretical but vitally important: the moral and legal vetting of the operation. Lawyers and senior staff debated the implications of acting on decrypted traffic. Would the action be framed internally as a legitimate act of war against a strategic commander? How would the Navy conceal the intelligence source? The chain of command produced memoranda that read like the minutes of a somber council. Intelligence preserved is intelligence saved. A single, well-concealed operation could be worth more to the war effort than a public triumph that revealed methods. The political burden of secrecy weighed heavily. If the mission succeeded, the public story would emphasize aerial skill and luck. The true mechanism, signals intelligence, would remain a secret for years. As April 18 approached, the airfield at Guadalcanal took on a 2-tone rhythm. Routine maintenance work during the day, tight, focused preparation at night. Crews checked fuel pumps, sealed drop tanks, strapped ammunition belts. Pilots performed final checks on harnesses and sighting instruments. Briefing rooms ran through the schedule like clockwork. At dawn on the day of the mission, the aircraft were wheeled out, engines cranked, and the smell of oil and warm metal spread across the runway. Ground crews moved with purposeful silence. Pilots sat in cockpits as if in prayer, head bowed over instruments, fingers tracing the dials that would tell them whether the plan held. In the planning room, cryptanalysts who had stitched the itinerary together returned to their ledgers with a different kind of tension. The knowledge that their work would move from pen and paper to action. Those men had been trained to be invisible. Their names would not appear in public dispatches for years, yet their signature would be felt in the sky. The men who had synchronized watches and calculated headings now watched too, waiting to learn whether the arithmetic would prove true. Orders were clear: maintain radio silence except for emergency transmissions. The fighters would fly in formations that minimized detection, low, fast, and tight. They would meet the Japanese flight at a precise point in space and time. The planners briefed a fallback. If the formation was not sighted at the scheduled time, the fighters were to return. No improvisation that might risk exposing sources or losing aircraft unnecessarily. Dawn came with the pale, thin air of an island morning. Engines started in a coordinated roar. The 16 P-38s rolled into line, exhausts trembling, propeller tips flashing. Men on the tarmac moved with the studied calm of those who had rehearsed panic into silence. The next moments were a simple sequence of mechanical actions and human choices. Release chocks, throttle up, radio check, silence, and takeoff in tight succession. Each takeoff sent a column of water spray and a surge of heat across the asphalt. As the first lightnings lifted, the island seemed to hold its breath. Pilots climbed to low cruising altitude and settled into the hours-long monotony of overwater flight. Ahead lay empty blue and the mathematical certainty of risk. Behind lay engines and men who had done their work meticulously. The mission that began in a cryptanalysis room with a penciled itinerary was now airborne, a fragile line of metal and resolve pressing toward a rendezvous that would demand absolute precision. They were, in every sense, racing against time. The time on their synchronized watches, the minutes before fuel bled away, and the compressed hour when decisions would have to be made with no room for error. Below them, the ocean might have looked infinite, but for those pilots it was simply another measuring instrument. Dead reckoning folded into muscle memory as they passed pre-planned waypoints. The horizon offered no clues, only a steady canvas of distance to be conquered by heading and speed. Every pilot kept a private ledger of worry, a gust that nudged the needle of a compass, a moment's misread that could send 16 fighters into a fruitless quadrant of sky. The knowledge that a successful intercept would mean confronting men and machines that had trained and lived in different skies. Back on Guadalcanal, at the fragile edge between military secrecy and public narrative, officers rubbed their temples and watched the clock. If the intercept failed, the question would linger whether the operation had been worth the risk. If it succeeded, the victory would be muffled by secrecy, and the story would be refracted for decades by debates over credit and method. Either way, the penciled itinerary that began as a simple line of typed words had launched men into a gamble that only the ocean and the next few hours could resolve. They pressed on. The logbooks recorded headings and times in small, exacting script. The pilots felt the hum of engines and the steady breath of the sea below. Nervous jokes, brief and brittle, broke the silence sometimes. Other times the cockpit was a place of concentrated solitude. For each man, the mission had become a quiet war inside his head. Stick to the plan, maintain your checklists, trust your leader. The sighting was almost anticlimactic. Not a thunder of alarms, but a precise confirmation of the math. The fighters slipped into position, drop tanks jettisoning with a dull clunk and a clean separation. The lightning suddenly lighter and far more agile. Engines surged. Voices in cockpits were small and economical. The radio silent except for a curt, prearranged wordless signal. Eyes and hands now, not voices. The approach was choreographed down to geometry. Attack profiles had been rehearsed. Climb to the designated altitude for the run. Present the nose guns to the Betty's vulnerable areas. Avoid becoming entangled with Zero escorts and break away on ruled headings to minimize exposure after firing. For most of the pilots, the plan produced a cold professionalism. Checklists carried to the edge of instinct. Instruments obeyed without thought. Muscles acting on rehearsed sequences. The first passes were brutal in their simplicity. The P-38's guns, cannons and heavy machine guns concentrated in the nose, spat a tight group of fire. They were designed to take away control and habitability. Radios, cockpit structures, fuel tanks. A well-aimed burst could blind a bomber in seconds. The Bettys were not built to absorb that sort of punishment. Panic in a multi-crew airplane is an amplifying thing. Loss of a radio operator, a fire in an engine nacelle, or sudden shudder of control surfaces could cascade into catastrophic failure. Accounts from the air are necessarily compressed in time. One moment the sky holds 2 fragile bombers and a scattering of fighters. The next, sheets of tracer, the bright signatures of impacts, and the silver birds twisted by sudden, decisive violence. The first Betty took the brunt and sagged, then began to tumble. Pilots in the P-38s later described watching crews bail, observing parachutes, details that were at once routine and awful. The second Betty, which carried the senior staff, including Admiral Yamamoto, received concentrated attention from more than one lightning. It is here that the accounts begin to diverge, and where human memory, professional pride, and the fog of combat begin to tangle. Immediately after the action, Captain Thomas G. Lanphier, Jr. filed a dramatic report. In his account, he described an inverted maneuver that placed his aircraft in a position to deliver the fatal volley, a cinematic depiction that fit neatly into the heroic narratives that often followed such sorties. Lanphier's report and subsequent public statements were forceful and helped shape the initial ribbon-cutting of the story, the image of a leader performing a decisive, almost acrobatic gesture that sealed the outcome. Lieutenant Rex T. Barber told a different sequence. His account, steady, procedural, described an attack from below and behind, the sort of approach that simple geometry and a P-38's armament favored when aiming at a bomber's stern or tail section. Barber emphasized identification procedures, angle of approach, and the observed reaction of the bomber as proof that his pass had done the decisive work. To many who examined his testimony later, these elements felt like the marks of a pilot who had relied on timing and positioning rather than on flamboyance. At the moment of combat, such distinctions mattered less than survival. The Zeros that escorted the bombers moved to intercept, and what followed was the frantic choreography of air combat, defensive turns, opportunistic dives, and the constant hazard of hitting one's own formation in the confusion. P-38s fought to maintain separation, to apply concentrated fire against the bombers, and to disengage before escorts could punish them. The Betty carrying Admiral Yamamoto was hit decisively. Contemporary reports described it as going down in a courtroom of smoke and broken metal, its descent quick and severe. Witnesses on the American side watched as it crashed into the sea near a small island. The wreckage was later located by Japanese search parties. The sea held its own silence over details that would be parsed and debated for decades. Pilots on scene reported seeing crew members exit and parachutes deploy. For the Americans, there was a complicated relief that the hostile formation had been neutralized, and a concurrent unease about survivors in the water and what might befall them. Intelligence personnel had, before the mission was flown, gathered grim reports of how downed Allied airmen had sometimes been treated when picked up by Japanese forces. Such worries did not soften the immediate sense of operational accomplishment, but made the aftermath morally complex in ways that brief radio messages and award citations would not capture. The return flight was itself an ordeal. With drop tanks gone and reserve fuel trimmed thin by combat, pilots and aircraft returned toward Guadalcanal on a threadbare economy of gallons and hope. Some P-38s bore damage from small arms fire or escort fighters. One aircraft returned with a mangled engine nacelle. Another limped home on one functioning engine. A few were lost to mechanical failure during the return or to fuel exhaustion. Others ditched or were forced down with uncertain fates. The fact that the majority made it back testified not only to the Lightning's advantages, but also to careful planning, the luck of weather, and, in darker cases, the narrowness of survival margins. Back on the island, the mood was a mixture of anxious relief and immediate procedural discipline. The mission had to be contained. Intelligence officers moved quickly to control narratives. Reports to higher command emphasized the tactical engagement. Fighters intercepted and shot down enemy bombers. The precise mechanism that had placed the fighters in that sky at that moment, the decoded itinerary, was, by design, left unspoken beyond a narrow circle. At Pacific Fleet Headquarters, commanders confronted the peculiar afterlife of such an operation. Victory, to be of use, had to be kept from undoing the source of victory, code breaking. Had the Japanese suspected their signals were compromised, they would have altered ciphers and procedures and denied the Allies that long strategic advantage. The loss of Admiral Yamamoto was a high-value outcome, but so too was the preservation of a unique intelligence window. The Navy's decision-makers moved to sanitize official justifications. Public statements framed the interception as the product of skillful reconnaissance and aerial combat. Signals intelligence remained a tightly held secret for years. That secrecy shaped public memory and also inflamed disputes over credit. Lanfear's public claims, amplified by press reports and official citations that sometimes preferred simplified narratives, contrasted with Barber's more private insistence on his role. In the immediate wake of the mission, all involved received commendations. Medals were distributed, and public ceremonies underlined the operation's symbolic significance. But in private and later in formal inquiries and court of historical opinion, questions about who delivered the fatal shots would not go away. The Japanese response, at first, was one of stunned grief and rapid reshuffling. Admiral Yamamoto's death removed a singular presence from the Imperial Navy. A commander who had combined strategic vision, a known skepticism of over-reliance on attrition, and a stature that commanded attention across the officer corps. Loss at that level creates ripple effects that go beyond military calculations. In Tokyo, the absence of a voice that had argued institutional memory into strategy altered debates and had political implications that filtered into decisions on the conduct of the war. For the Allied command, Yamamoto's death carried its own ambiguities. It was a hard strike against an enemy leader, and yet its public justification was muted. Intelligence officers who had insisted on secrecy felt vindicated on the narrow point that their methods remained protected. But they also bore the psychological weight of having ordered an attack that targeted a single, identifiable commander. In staff rooms and private notes, some wrestled with the moral contours of such an operation in ways that would be discussed over years rather than during headlines. Over the following months and years, the story of the intercept evolved into layers: official dispatches, veteran memoirs, and later historical research. Lanfear's early narrative lent itself to media attention. Barber's quieter claims had less immediate traction. For decades, the record contained both versions, each with adherents and critics. Some saw Lanfear's account as consistent with a daring aerial maneuver. Others judged Barber's testimony more aligned with ballistics and crash site evidence as it would later emerge. The wreckage assessments and Japanese records provided new pieces of evidence over time. Naval investigators and scholars examined photographs of the crash scene and autopsy-type reports that detailed the wounds and damage patterns. Ballistic trajectories, entry trajectories of rounds, and the orientation of the aircraft as it hit the water were analyzed against reported attack vectors. Eyewitness statements, Japanese survivors, American pilots, and neutral observers were compared and cross-checked. From these sources emerged a cumulative picture that suggested a shot string consistent with an attack coming from below and to the rear rather than the inverted, head-on pass described by some. By the turn of the 21st century, several historians had revisited archives that were unavailable immediately after the war. Declassified materials, photographs, Japanese investigative reports, and previously unpublished eyewitness notes allowed for more rigorous reconstruction. In 2003, a detailed scholarly study synthesized much of this material and argued that the weight of evidence favored Lieutenant Rex T. Barber as having delivered the fatal shots. The analysis cited specific types of evidence: the pattern of damage to the bomber's tail and fuselage, the trajectory consistent with Barber's described angle of attack, testimony from Japanese survivors about where fire appeared to come from, and navigational alignments that made Barber's positioning more probable than an inverted pass by Lanfear. This conclusion was not presented as an absolute fiat, but as the best supported interpretation based on the documents and forensic correlations then available. Even with that scholarly leaning, the debate retained human complexity.
Men's reputations, the prestige attached to public narratives, and the political uses of wartime stories all complicated simple closure. Lanfear's public persona and rhetoric had helped shape early perceptions. Barber's quieter yet technically detailed account gained traction as archival evidence accumulated. Historians emphasized process over triumphalism. This was how historical truth often advances, through the slow aggregation of documents, the testing of claims against physical evidence, and a willingness to revise narratives that had been formed in the fog of war. There are other threads to pull at in the aftermath that illuminate the operation's wider impact. Operationally, the success demonstrated the potency of linking signals intelligence to precise action. It underscored the necessity of protecting sources. The Navy's restraint in public disclosure preserved a vital advantage in the months that followed. Tactically, the mission showcased the P-38's unique utility in the Pacific: long-range, concentrated forward firepower, and twin engines that provided redundancy over hostile waters.
It also reinforced lessons. Dead reckoning is fragile. Drop tanks complicate combat agility, and low-altitude navigation is a skill of rare precision. Psychologically, the strike was a blow to Japanese morale and to the perception of invulnerability in high command. Admiral Yamamoto's loss removed a balancing voice within the military leadership, contributing to a leadership culture that increasingly embraced riskier strategies as the war progressed. For Allied forces, the operation had both the uplifting quality of a successful, high-stakes mission and the sobering ambiguity of an action that relied on secrecy and targeted a singular leader. Ethically, the mission sits at an uneasy intersection. Targeting a military commander during active conflict sits within accepted wartime norms. Leaders who direct war are, by most conventions, legitimate military targets. Yet the decision to act on decrypted communications added a layer of accountability and discretion that weighed on planners. They had to balance potential strategic gain against intelligence loss and the moral implications of taking a life in a carefully premeditated strike that a single pencil had made possible. Veterans and officers who later reflected on the mission often described mixed feelings: professional satisfaction at executing a difficult operation, regret at the human cost, and pride in the skill displayed by their services. These emotions were not uniform. They were shaped by rank, role, and the passage of time. There is also a technical legacy. Operation Vengeance, this is the name the mission acquired, illuminated how modern warfare increasingly depended on a marriage between technical expertise and kinetic action. Codebreakers, whose work had once seemed removed from the battlefield, now reached across maps and hours to shape tactical decisions. Aviation engineering, navigation techniques, and the know-how of maintenance crews were all called into the same choreography. The mission foreshadowed later practices in which intelligence-driven, targeted actions would become a recurring feature of military strategy. For the men at Station Hypo and at Guadalcanal, the arc of recognition and secrecy unfolded unevenly. Many cryptoanalysts and intelligence officers who had participated in or supported the operation remained unacknowledged publicly for years. The secrecy that protected wartime advantage also delayed the ability of historians and the public to fully understand the operation's origins and mechanics. In some cases, secrecy protected careers and saved lives by preventing the enemy from hardening codes. In others, it perpetuated contested public narratives that took decades to untangle. When the crash site details were gradually released and studied, they added to the impression that Barber's account fit the physical evidence more cleanly. Specifically, damage patterns and positions of impact indicated hits from a rear lower angle. Japanese accounts, some given to investigators soon after the event, others recorded later, described fire appearing from below the bomber, lending weight to the theory that an attack from beneath and astern had struck the decisive shots. These converging lines of evidence did not create a unanimous verdict, but did tilt scholarly consensus. That consensus, however, did not erase complexities of attribution.
Lanfear had been awarded and celebrated early. Barber had fought for recognition in the decades that followed. Official revisions and acknowledgments moved slowly, shaped by archival discoveries and shifting public interest. The story thus became a case study in how history integrates combat reports, material evidence, and human testimony to arrive at provisional conclusions. Beyond questions of credit lay the human cost. Men forced into the sea faced uncertain fates. Survivors' testimonies detailed the confusion and desperation of crash and capture. For the larger Japanese Navy, the loss of a key leader raised questions about continuity, succession, and the morale of those who had served under him. For Americans, the sense of a decisive blow carried strategic satisfaction, tempered with the reality that the war would continue in brutal, grinding fashion. In strategic terms, Yamamoto's death did not end Japanese operational competence. The Imperial Navy continued to fight fiercely. But the removal of one voice that had argued caution and balance did alter internal debates. Where once a respected admiral had been able to temper some impulses, the leadership that remained faced increasing pressure to reverse setbacks with boldness that sometimes overlooked logistical realities. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders and on public perception was significant. The loss of a figure so closely associated with early strategic planning was a blow to prestige and continuity. In Allied circles, the mission became a touchstone for discussions about the use of intelligence in operations, how to exploit fragile opportunities without burning sources. It informed later doctrine about compartmentalization of knowledge and the need for plausible deniability when operations hinged on signals intelligence. The operations planners and executors would teach future generations how to translate quiet work into decisive action and how to manage the aftermath, awards, narratives, and the maintenance of necessary secrecy. Decades later, historians would also reflect on the human stories behind the headlines. The code breakers bent over ledgers, the pilots whose training and nerves held under strain, and the maintenance crews whose careful work kept engines running over vast blue distances. Each element had been indispensable. The mission was not the product of a single genius or a single moment of courage. It was the result of an ecosystem of skill and discipline. As memory matured into scholarship, the operation took on layered meanings. It is remembered as a daring use of intelligence and aviation that shocked Japan by removing one of its most prominent naval leaders. It is remembered also as a cautionary tale about secrecy, about the ethical weight of targeted strikes, and about how heroic narratives can complicate the search for truth. Historians continue to work at the margins of the record, refining understandings and correcting errors. The story resists tidy closure because it is anchored in human decisions made under pressure, and because the evidence, like any human record, carries gaps and prejudice. Back on Guadalcanal and in the dim rooms at Station Hypo, men who had touched the operation in small ways carried private memories that did not always make it into official dispatches. Some kept journals, others told their children only fragments. When the story finally emerged into public awareness in fuller form, it reshaped how the war's public reckoning incorporated intelligence work. The public learned that wars are not only won with loud victories, but also with quiet labor, pencil strokes, watch synchronizations, patient decoding. The shock Japan felt was not simply the result of aerial skill, it was an effect of an intelligence chain that translated ink into action. That pencil stroke on April 14 did not feel portentous in the moment it was made. It was one entry among many, tactical data input into a ledger of war. But in the weeks and months that followed, that small notation linked the patient work of code breakers to the whir of engines and the flash of gunfire. The operation it spawned combined mathematics and courage, secrecy and spectacle. It killed a man who had been, in many measures, a defining strategist of his Navy. It altered debates in Tokyo and in the Pacific command posts. It created winners and also questions that time and research would continue to probe. As assessments accumulated, as wreckage was studied, and as archives opened, historians leaned toward an interpretation that credited Lieutenant Barber with the decisive attack while acknowledging Captain Lanfear's role in the engagement and the complexity of human testimony. That conclusion stands as a model of historical method, not a closure that erases dispute, but a reasoned, evidence-based foregrounding of the most likely sequence. It is also a reminder that history often proceeds by degrees, correcting and refining its claims as new material becomes available. In the end, the mission's significance lies less in the drama of whose guns fired the fatal rounds and more in what the operation demonstrated about the conduct of modern war. It showed how intelligence can create opportunity and how opportunity must be balanced against the cost of revealing sources. It revealed the extraordinary demands placed on pilots asked to fly farther than was comfortable into empty ocean and to execute with mathematical precision.
It highlighted the hidden labor of the men who kept machines serviceable and of the analysts who translated enemy habits into actionable routes. And it forced an ethical conversation about the targeted removal of an enemy leader, a conversation as old as warfare and as consequential as any tactical victory. Years after the mission, when veterans returned to ordinary lives and documents moved from classified to public, the story persisted in history books, museum exhibits, and archival articles. It became a chapter in broader narratives about the Pacific War, a case study in the orchestration of intelligence and action, and a moment when the quiet work of specialists intersected with the thunder of combat. For students of military history, Operation Vengeance is taught as an example of constraint-driven planning, of the limits of air power, and of the human dimensions that determine whether a plan survives rehearsal and becomes reality. The pencil that had stopped on Departure, 0600 Tokyo time, April 18, remained a small, almost invisible thing in the margins of the larger war. Yet that small mark linked rooms and runways, cryptoanalysts and pilots, policymakers and mechanics. It set in motion decisions that reverberated through the Pacific, and it forced those who participated to live with the consequences, operationally and morally, of turning knowledge into action. When historians, veterans, and students return to this episode, they find not a simple story of heroism, but a layered account that insists on nuance. It is a story that honors skill and discipline without reducing the moral gravity of targeted violence. It respects the technical ingenuity that made the mission possible, while questioning the costs of secrecy that obscured truth for years. Above all, it stands as an operative lesson that in modern conflict, the quietest rooms can wield the sharpest instruments, and that the smallest details, a line of decoded text, a synchronized watch, a pilot's steady hand, can change the course of events in ways both immediate and enduring. Operation Vengeance remains a turning point, a surgical strike born of patient intelligence work and precise flying that shocked a nation and reshaped one corner of a global war. Its legacy is mixed: tactical brilliance married to moral unease, clarity of purpose married to secrecy. Yet in the slow forensic labor of historians, the story has been refined into a less mythic and more human account. One that credits method, accepts ambiguity, and honors the difficult calculus that commanders and crews wrestled with in the Pacific skies. If this exploration into the confluence of code-breaking, navigation, and aerial combat resonated with you, consider diving deeper into the topics that made this mission possible. The work of Station Hypo, the design and operational use of the P-38 Lightning, and Admiral Yamamoto's complex role in Japanese strategy. There are linked videos and detailed sources that unpack each of those threads. Join the conversation, share your thoughts and questions, and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments where small decisions on paper reshaped the course of history.